David, speaking of the oath of office, that even grade school kids know that upon the death of the president, the vice president immediately becomes president.
Right.
Why do you think LBJ took the time, given this national crisis, to have Judge Sarah Hughes come to the airplane for the official swearing in that would not have needed to take place?
Yeah.
What's behind that?
Well, what's behind that is a delay the takeoff from Dallas. That's exactly what's behind it, because when Johnson tells the Kennedy party, well, they're amazed that the flight is being delayed. Why not? Why can't we take off right now? Okay, so you're on our airplane, but let's go. And he says, no, Bobby told me to be sworn in first. And he repeated that again and again and again. And one of the things that happened that evening was that different Kennedy aides would tell Bobby, you know, Johnson said that you told him to delay the flight for swearing in. He said, that's ridiculous. And anyway, it's a clear matter of history now that Bobby Kennedy says basically that that's not true, so that Lyndon Johnson lied. And so that's just a fact.
And the purpose of the delaying the plane leaving,
right, was to give time so that something could be done to the body.
So that's the time they used. That's the time right there. So while he's taking the oath of office in the plane, below in luggage, President Kennedy's body, the head, is being bludgeoned.
I believe so. Yep.
That's the time frame they used.
Yeah,
that's the reason for the delay of takeoff.
That's the reason for the delay of takeoff. The time they got the body on the plane at 2:18, the swearing in is at 2:38. I wouldn't be surprised if they were done by 2:38. But anyway, they didn't take off till 2:47. So you have that time. I think it's 29 minutes from 2:18 to 2:47 or something. That's your time period. And it's after the swearing in that Johnson turns around and Congressman Thomas, it gives him this broad wink, and Stoughton's photograph captures that wink. I was the one that discovered the wink photograph.
Right. And published it for the first time.
And published it for the first time.
Right.
And I called up Stoughton about it. You know, when I found it, first of all, I found it, I mean, in a way by accident. My birthday was coming up, and I said, I want to give myself a birthday present. I ordered all the swearing-in photographs from the LBJ library. There's about 15 or whatever they are. I want to get them all and see who was upstairs in the plane and who was not. So the pictures come in, and they had published these pictures once before in Time magazine back in 1967 when Manchester's book was published, because Manchester said that certain Kennedy aide, Kenny O'Donnell, wasn't there, and it turns out the picture shows that he was there. Okay, so that was a big news story. So now I get out my magnifying glass and I'm looking, and then there's one more picture that was in the official Time magazine publication. And there's this congressman winking at Johnson. This big wink, you know.
Totally inappropriate.
Totally inappropriate to say the thing, but the thing I didn't know at the time was that the major role that Congressman Thomas played in getting Kennedy to make the trip to Texas, which we'll get to in a minute, telling him this whole story about I've got cancer and you got to come here to my dinner.
Let's talk about that a bit.
Okay.
Because people think that the reason JFK went to Texas was to heal a rift in the Democratic Party. That's sort of the story.
Right.
So tell me about Al Thomas and what his role was.
Okay, first of all, the rift in the Democratic Party, I am sure, was promoted by Johnson. It's not a story. He took actions to create a rift.
To create a rift.
Create a rift. And then they say, oh, you got to come here and heal the rift. Okay. But the real big reason, the really big reason was not just that Johnson kept nagging Kennedy to come to Dallas for political reasons, and you got to help because the '64 election's coming up, you know, and Goldwater is going to be the opposition. But in addition, his buddy Al Thomas, who was a very powerful congressman, he controlled like 10% of the United States budget, including the whole NASA space program.
Which was near and dear to JFK's heart.
Very near and dear to JFK's heart. And he was an important Texas liberal. So he's an important person on one of the major committees to get the program through. So suddenly, in April 1963, Thomas announces he's resigning. And he then goes to President Kennedy and says, I have cancer, and I'm resigning. And there's this, it's in the Washington newspapers, and Kennedy is kind of like, don't resign, we need you to get the program through. He said, well, I'm having this testimonial dinner in my honor on November 21st, 1963 in Houston, and I'd be mighty obliged if you'd come to Houston. So the reason Kennedy went to Texas, and that's the original reason, was to come to Houston to the Al Thomas dinner. But that's the anchor for the trip. Okay. And then you start adding on things like bells and whistles on a Christmas tree, you know, and then they add all these other cities, and there's motorcades in every city.
Austin, Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio.
San Antonio. And the order is San Antonio, Houston for the dinner, the next morning Fort Worth. And there's a lot of finagling, and then comes Dallas and Austin. And there's a lot of finagling going on because originally San Antonio was on a different day. They had to really do a lot of playing around with the schedule to make it so that that the motorcade would leave from the airport. And they had to make, San Antonio was on Friday, it had to be shifted to Thursday. There's a lot of stuff going on, but Thomas was centrally involved in getting Kennedy to make this trip to Texas. So there he is winking at Lyndon Johnson. And you have to know the whole cancer story. By the way, Thomas's cancer went into remission. Kennedy's dead from the bullets, but Thomas lived for a few more years.
And did he resign from Congress, or did that
No,
not happen?
he died. He died in 1967 or something. But another thing that happened is in the fall of '63, when Kennedy balked about the trip, there was some problem about Kennedy not really deciding to make this Texas trip. Thomas then took a meat axe to the space program. And basically, the message was, if you don't come to Houston, you're not going to the moon.
Wow.
And that's the deal.
Wow.
If you don't come to Houston, you're not going to the moon. So they
used that leverage over
used that
JFK
leverage
to get him down to Dallas.
Texas.
To Texas.
Texas. And of course, from Texas, I mean, Thomas doesn't control the Dallas stuff. That's dealing with a different cast of characters. And then you get into other, but it's basically an Al Thomas trip. Yes. And that was not brought out sufficiently before the Warren Commission.